Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name's Dr. James Gill and you've joined me for something slightly different today. The last few years, around Christmas time, I have recorded a video for my nephew Harrison. Hello little man. And today we're going to carry on that tradition. Today approaching the Nutcracker. Now, I've not actually read this book before. I've got a rough idea about it, but nevertheless I'm quite interested to see where the flow goes because it's not the shortest of things, and it has been told to me that the original unabridged version is not quite Disney in terms of the themes. So we'll see how Christmassy this Christmas tale is. Well, with that, we may or may not be joined by the cat shortly. If you're ready and willing, we shall carry on with The Nutcracker by E.T.A. Hoffmann, translated from the German. 1853. Chapter 1, Christmas Eve. During the long day of the 24th of December, the children of Dr. Stahlbaum were not permitted to enter the parlour, much less the adjoining drawing-room. Frederick and Maria sat nestled together in the corner of the black chamber. Dusky twilight had come on, and they felt quite gloomy and fearful, for, as was common on these days, no light was brought into them. Fred, in great secrecy and in a whisper, informed his little sister, for she was only just 7 years old, that ever since the morning he had heard a rustling and rattling, and now and then a gentle knocking in the forbidden chambers. Not long ago he had also seen a little dark man with a large chest under his arm gliding softly through the entry, but he knew very well it was nobody but Godfather Drosselmeyer. Upon this, Maria clapped her little hands together joyfully and exclaimed, "Oh, what beautiful things has Godfather Drosselmeyer made for us this time!" Councillor Drosselmeyer did not a very handsome man make. He was small and thin, and had many wrinkles on his face. Over his right eye he wore a large black patch, and was without hair, for which reason he wore a very nice white wig. This was made of glass, however, and it was a very ingenious piece of work. The godfather himself was also very ingenious too. He understood all about clocks and watches, and could even make them. Accordingly, when any one of the beautiful clocks in Dr. Stahlbaum's house was sick and couldn't sing, Godfather Drosselmeyer would have to attend it, and he would take off his glass wig, pull off his brown hat coat, put on a blue apron, and pierce the clock with sharp pointed instruments, which usually caused little Maria a great deal of anxiety. But it did the clock no harm. On the contrary, it became quite lively again, and began at once to ring right merrily, and rattle and strike, and sing to all who heard it. Whenever he came, he always brought something pretty in his pocket for the children. Sometimes a little man who moved his eyes and made a bow at others. A box from which a little bird hopped out when it was opened. Sometimes one thing, sometimes another. When Christmas Eve came, he had always a beautiful piece of work prepared for them, which cost him a great deal of trouble, and on this account it was always carefully preserved by their parents after he had given it to them. "Oh, what a beautiful present has Godfather Drosselmeyer made for us this time!" exclaimed Maria. It was Fred's opinion that this time it would be nothing else than a castle in which all kinds of fine soldiers marched up and down and went through their exercises. Then other soldiers would come and try to break into the castle, but the soldiers would fire off their cannon very bravely until all roared and cracked again. "No, no," cried Maria, interrupting him. "Godfather Drosselmeyer has told me of a lovely garden where there is a great lake upon which beautiful swans swim about, with golden collars around their neck, and they sing the sweetest songs. Then out comes a little girl into the garden, down along the lake, and coaxes the swans to the shore, and feeds them with sweet cake." "Swans never eat cake," interrupted Fred somewhat roughly, "and even Godfather Drosselmeyer himself can't make a whole garden. After all, we've had a little good play with his things. They're all taken right away from us." I like what Mama and Papa give us much better, for we can keep their presents for ourselves and we do with them as we please. The children now began once more to guess what it could be this time. Maria thought that Miss Trutchen, her great doll, was growing very old, for she fell almost every moment upon the floor, and more awkwardly than ever, and which could not happen without leaving sad marks upon her face. And as to the neatness in dress, this was now altogether out of the question with her. Scolding did not help the matter in the least. Frederick declared, on the other hand, that a bay horse was wanting in his stable, and that his troops were deficient in cavalry, as his papa knew very well. By this time it had become quite dark. Frederick and Maria sat close together, and did not venture again to speak a word. It seemed now as if soft wings rustled round them, and a very distant but sweet music was heard at intervals. At this moment a shrill sound broke upon their ears. Cling-ling, cling-ling. The doors flew wide open, and such a dazzling light broke out from the great chamber that, with a loud exclamation, "Ah, ah!" the children stood fixed at the threshold. But Papa and Mamma stepped to the door, took them by the hand, and said, "Come, come, dear children, come and see what Christmas has brought you this year." The gifts. Kind reader, or listener, whatever may be your name, whether Frank, Robert, Henry, Anna, or Maria, I beg you to call to mind the table covered with your last Christmas gifts, as in their newest gloss they first appeared to your delighted vision. You will then be able to imagine the astonishment of the children as they stood with sparkling eyes, unable to utter a word for joy at the sight before them. At last Maria called out with a deep sigh, "Ah, how beautiful! Ah, how beautiful!" And Frederick gave 2 or 3 leaps in the air, higher than he had ever done before. The children must have been very obedient and very good children during the last year, for never on any Christmas Eve before had so many beautiful things been given to them. A tall fir tree stood in the middle of the room, covered with gold and silver apples, while sugar almonds, comfits, lemon drops, and every kind of confectionery hung like buds and blossoms upon all its branches. But the greatest beauty about this wonderful tree was the many little lights that sparkled amid its dark boughs, which, like stars, illuminated its treasures, or, like friendly eyes, seemed to invite the children to partake of its blossoms and fruit. The table under the tree shone and flushed with 1,000 different colours. Ah, what beautiful things they were! Who can describe them? Maria spied the prettiest dolls, a tea set, all kinds of nice little furniture, and what eclipsed all the rest, a silk dress tastefully ornamented with gay ribbons, which hung upon a frame before her eyes, so she could view it on every side. This she did too, and exclaimed over and over again, "Ah, the sweet, ah, the dear, dear frock! May I put it on? Yes, yes, may I really, though, wear it?" In the meanwhile, Fred had been galloping around and round the room, trying his new bay horse, which, true enough, he'd found fastened by its bridle to the table. Dismounting again, he said it was a wild creature, but it was nothing, and he would break him soon. He then reviewed his new regiment of hussars, who were very elegantly arrayed in red and gold, and carried silver weapons, and rode upon such bright, shining horses that you would almost believe they were pure silver also. The children had now become somewhat more composed, and turned to the picture books which lay open on the table, where all kinds of beautiful flowers and gaily dressed people, boys and girls, were at play, and were painted as naturally as if they were alive. Yes, the children had just turned to these singular books when, cling-ling, cling-ling, the bell was heard again. They knew that Godfather Drosselmeyer was now about to display his Christmas gift, and ran towards the table that stood against the wall, covered by a curtain reaching from ceiling to floor. The curtain, behind which he'd remained so long concealed, was quickly drawn aside, and what the children saw then? Upon a green meadow, spangled with flowers, stood a noble castle, with clear glass windows and golden turrets. A musical clock began to play, and when the doors and windows flew open, and little men and women, with feathers in their hats and long flowing trains, were seen sauntering about in the rooms. In the middle hall, which seemed as if all were on fire, so many little tapers were burning in the silver chandeliers, there were children in white frocks and green jackets dancing to the sound of music. A man in an emerald green cloak at intervals put his head out of a window and nodded and disappeared. And Godfather Drosselmeyer himself, only that he was not much bigger than Papa's thumb, now came out, then to the castle door, looked about him and went in again. Fred, with his arms resting on the table, gazed at the beautiful castle and the little walking and dancing figures, and then said, "Godfather Drosselmeyer, let me go into your castle." The counsellor gave him to understand that that could not be done, and for he was right, for it was foolish that Fred would wish to go into a castle, gold turrets not as high even as his head. Fred saw that likewise himself, and afterward, as the men and women kept walking back and forth, and the children danced, and the Emerald Man looked out of his window, Godfather Drosselmeyer came to the door, and all without the least change, Fred called out patiently, "Oh, Godfather Drosselmeyer, come out this time, out the other door." "That can never be, dear Fred," said the counsellor. "Well then," continued Frederick, "let the green man who peeps out of the window walk about with the rest." "That can never be," rejoined the counsellor. "Then the children must come down," cried Fred. "I want to see them nearer." "All that can never be, I say," replied the counsellor, a little out of humour. "As the mechanism is made, so it must remain." "So, oh," cried Fred in the drawling tone, "all that can never be? Listen, Godfather Drosselmeyer, if your little dressed-up figures in that castle there can do nothing else but always the same, they are no good for much, and I care very little about them. No, give me my hussars, who can manoeuvre backwards and forwards as I order, and they'll not shut up in a house." With this, he darted towards a large table, drew up his regiment upon their silver horses, and let them trot and gallop, and cut and slash to his heart's content. Maria had also stolen softly away, for she too had tired soon of the sauntering and dancing puppets in the castle, but she was very amiable and good. She did not wish it to be so observed so plainly as it was in her brother Fred. Counsellor Drosselmeyer turned to the parents and said somewhat angrily, "An ingenious work like this is not made for stupid children. I will put my castle up again and carry it home." But the mother now stepped forward and desired to see the secret mechanism and the curious works by which the little figures were set in motion. The counsellor took it all apart and then put it back together again. While he was employed in this manner, he became good-natured once more, and gave the children some nice ginger men and women, with gilt faces, hands and feet. They were made of sweet gingerbread, at which Frederick and Maria were greatly delighted. At her mother's request, the elder sister, Louise, had put on a new dress which had been given to her, and she looked most charmingly in it. But Maria, when it came to her turn, thought she would like to look at hers a while longer as it hung, and this was readily permitted. The favourite. The truth is, Maria was unwilling to leave the table then, because she had discovered something upon it which no one had yet remarked upon. By the marching out of Fred's hussars, who had been drawing up close to the tree, a curious little man came into view, who stood there, silent and tired, as if he were waiting quietly for his turn to be noticed. It must be confessed that a great deal could not be said in favour of the beauty of his figure, for not only was he rather broad, stout in body, and all out of proportion to the little slim legs that carried it, but his head was by far too large for either. A genteel dress went a great way to compensate for these defects, but it led to the belief that he must be a man of taste and good breeding. He wore a hussar's jacket of beautiful bright violet, fastened together with white loops and buttons, pantaloons of exactly the same colour, and the greatest boots that ever graced the foot of a student or an officer. They fitted as tight to his little legs as if they were painted upon them. It was laughable to see that in addition to this handsome apparel, he had hung upon his back a narrow, clumsy cloak that looked as if it were made of wood, and on his head he wore a woodsman's cap, but Maria remembered that Godfather Drosselmeyer wore an old shabby cloak and an ugly cap, and he was still dear, a dear godfather. Maria could not help thinking also that even if Godfather Drosselmeyer were, in other respects, as well dressed as this little fellow, yet after all he would not look half as handsome as he. The longer Maria gazed upon the little man with whom she had taken a liking to at first sight, the more she was sensible how much good nature and friendliness was expressed in his features. Nothing but kindness and benevolence shone in his clear, green, although somewhat too prominent eyes. It was very becoming to the man that he wore about his chin a nicely trimmed beard of white cotton, for by this the sweet smile upon his deep red lips was rendered much more striking. "Ah, dear father," exclaimed Maria at last, "to whom belongs the charming little man by the tree there?" "He shall work industriously for you all, dear child," said her father. "He can crack the hardest nuts with his teeth, and he belongs as well to Louise as to you and Fred." With these words her father took him carefully from the table and raised up his wooden cloak, whereupon the little man stretched his mouth wide open and showed 2 rows of very white, sharp teeth. At her father's bidding, Maria put in a nut, and crack! The little man had bitten it in 2, and so the shell fell off, and Maria caught the sweet kernel in her hand. Maria and the 2 other children were now informed that this dainty little man came to the family of Nutcrackers and practised the profession of his forefathers. Maria was overjoyed at what she heard, and her father said, "Dear Maria, since friend Nutcracker is so great a favourite with you, I place him under your particular care and keeping, although, as I said before, Louise and Fred shall have as much right to his services as you." Maria took him immediately in her arms and set him to cracking nuts, but she picked out the smallest, so that the little fellow need not stretch his mouth open so wide, which, in truth, was not very becoming to him. Louise sat down by her, and friend Nutcracker must perform the same service to her too, which he seemed quite willingly to do, for he kept smiling all the while very pleasantly. In the meantime, Fred had become tired of riding and parading his hussars, and when he heard the nuts crack so merrily, he ran to his sister and laughed very heartily at the droll little man, who now, since Fred must have a share in the sport, passed from hand to hand, and thus there was no end to his labour. Fred always chose the biggest and hardest nuts, when, all at once, crack, crack, it went, and 3 teeth fell out of the Nutcracker's mouth, and his whole under jaw became loose and rickety. "Ah, my poor dear Nutcracker," said Maria, and snatched him out of Fred's hands. "What a stupid fellow," said Fred. "He wants to be a Nutcracker, and has poor teeth. He doesn't understand his trade. Give him to me, Maria. He shall crack nuts for me if he loses all of his teeth, and his whole chin in the bargain. Why make such a fuss about a fellow?" "No, no," exclaimed Maria, weeping. "You shall not have my dear Nutcracker. See how sorrowful he looks at me, and shows his poor mouth. But you are a hard-hearted fellow. You beat your horses, yes, and lately you've had one of your soldiers shot through the head." "That's all right," said Fred, "though you wouldn't understand it. But the Nutcracker belongs—" "That's all right," said Fred, "though you don't understand it. But the Nutcracker belongs as much to me as you, so let me have him." Maria began to cry bitterly and rolled up the sick Nutcracker as quietly as she could in her little pocket handkerchief. The parents came up with Godfather Drosselmeyer. The latter, to Maria's great distress, took Fred's part, but their father said, "I have placed the Nutcracker expressly under Maria's protection, and, as I see, he is now greatly in need of it. I gave her full authority over him, and no one must dispute it. Besides, I wonder at Fred that he should require farther duty from one who has been maimed in the service. As a good soldier, he ought to know that the wounded are not expected to take their place in the ranks." Fred was much ashamed, and without troubling himself farther about the nuts or the Nutcracker, stole round to the opposite end of the table, where his hussars, after stationing suitable outposts, had encamped for the night. Maria collected the Nutcracker's lost teeth, tied up his wounded chin with a nice white ribbon, which she had taken from her dress, and then wrapped the little fellow carefully, more than ever, in her handkerchief, for he looked very pale and frightened. Thus she held him, rocking him in her arms like a little child, and while she looked over the beautiful pictures of the new picture book which she found among her other Christmas gifts. Contrary to her usual disposition, she showed some ill temper towards Father Drosselmeyer, who kept continually laughing at her, and asked again and again how it was that she liked to caress such an ugly little fellow. That singular comparison with Drosselmeyer, which she'd made when her eyes first fell upon the Nutcracker, now came again into her mind, and she said very seriously, "Who knows, dear godfather? If you were dressed like my sweet Nutcracker, and had on such bright little boots, who knows but you would be as handsome as he?" Maria could not tell why her parents laughed out so loudly at this, and why the counsellor's face turned so red, and he, for his part, did not laugh half so heartily this time as he had done more than once before. It's likely there was some particular reason for it.